Hello everyone, Nick Jacobson. Now we are here on to episode 5D, the fourth video for episode 5 covering the fight portion. I've come a long way. It's taken a lot of need to try to correct some of the information that's been spread and talked about involved in the fight. And even when I'm sharing with you, again, you're not walking out of this being a trained fighter, but we wanted you to have some tools to work with. We still have to cover a few different closing comments regarding the fight and wrap a few things up, cover a few what ifs. With that, let's first jump all the way back to what we showed on our first episode. So you're in the ready. We're always in a low state of the ready, whether we're driving to work or we're at our place of business, out in the park, enjoying time at the movie theater. And then, boom, a fight comes to you, and we're talking specifically about fighting with an individual armed with a firearm. We're not talking about knives at the moment. We're not talking about bombs. We're not talking about vehicles. We're not talking about fists or blunt objects. We're talking about a firearm fight. With the firearm fight, you have to first get out and stay out of the line of fire. Then control the weapon, not the shooter. And that's when the fight starts. This is what we covered and discussed heavily, especially primarily the line of fire and the gaining control of that weapon in the previous two videos. If you only saw one video and went from 5B and jumped straight here to 5D and you didn't find video 5C, it's because I was forced to take that video down. I hope it doesn't have to, but even then, the first video still depicts, even though it's not quite as good of a quality, these two things: get out, stay out of the line of fire, and gain control of that weapon, not the shooter. They are not the main threat. All right, but let's now talk over a few extra things that we only mildly touched on. And we actually heavily touched on improvised weapons, but I want to retouch on that, what to do with the weapon and the throwing of objects. So improvised weapons, as a recap and a reminder, the time and place for the improvised weapons is not the individual who's on point on that door. That person's job is to gain control of the weapon and to control that weapon. By controlling that weapon, you control the threat. The individual behind them can then use the improvised weapon. Now, here's a question we commonly would get. Well, what if? What if they have more than one weapon? What if they have both a rifle or a shotgun and a pistol? Well, statistically speaking, and what we have seen when it comes to these types of events, especially at schools, the individuals actually do have more than one weapon. But we've also seen the fact is that these individuals are not trained to transition from one weapon to the other. Again, just like a disarm or any sort of a fighting technique, transitioning from one weapon to another takes practice and muscle memory. We have yet to see people who are properly trained in firearms tactics beyond target shooting and target practice. They're not well trained for these things. They're not trained to transition. When you take that primary weapon that they're using from them, their first thoughts are going to be to regain control of that weapon. But even if not, you're still taking what is the primary weapon away from them before you unleash your attack. Say you get the weapon from them or weapons. What do you do with it? Especially if you're in a classroom setting, but really anywhere. If you're in a place where you gain control of that weapon, do not go running down the hallways or down the street or whatever. Don't go running up to law enforcement and say, hey, I've got the gun, I stopped the shooter. Because they are in a high stress situation too, just like you were. All they know and they have from information is that there's a shooting happening. They see you with that weapon. They might think that you're the shooter. There are stories of even plainclothed officers or off-duty officers who are right next to schools where shootings began, go and respond to these shooting events and get shot in the process because their other fellow officers, they call that a blue-on-blue event. Their other fellow officers, all they see is an individual with a firearm and they have a report that there's a shooting and they're there to stop the threat. The best thing you can do if you end up with one of those firearms is to put it into like we said, that one video, put it into a trash can, put it in a place where it's out of sight and out of reacquisition from the shooter. Because just because you took the shooter down, even if you say used their own firearm against them and shot them. There's nothing to say that once they're incapacitated that they don't regain consciousness, regain control of that weapon, and then continue on with their assault. So get that weapon out of the space. Get it away from them, out of sight. Even a trash can next room down or down the hall. If you're running down a hallway or a street or whatever with a trash can in your hands, that does not look threatening. It's holding that weapon openly that will make you look like you are the threat. So that's what you do with a firearm. Throwing of objects. This is what I see being repeatedly misrepresented and mistaught. The throwing of objects. And it comes down to a thing that's also being inappropriately taught many times. It's called the OODA loop process. So what is OODA loop? You may have even heard this term before, especially if you've been taught under certain programs that aren't specifically run, hide, fight. Although I've seen run, hide, fight instructors teach this too incorrectly. So what is it? It's a real phenomenon that actually came out of the Air Force and their research and understanding. What is it that is the mental process our pilots are going through when they're identified, when they identify targets and threats? What is that mental process and what leads to their decision-making process? And how can we minimize that mental process to maximize the ability to respond to threats quickly? And so what came out of it was OODA loop. Observe. You observe the threat in your environment. You orient yourself to that threat. I'm here, they're there. You then decide, what are you going to do about that? Active shooter event, am I going to run? Am I going to fight? Am I going to hide? How are you going to act upon that decision? That action is the final stage. And they call it the loop because every time there's a new stimulus brought into your environment, you technically re-go through this process. Now, the way it's being taught, and I'll try to find that video, the way many people are teaching this is that, all you got to do is just grab an object and throw it at the shooter. Water bottle, a book, and many people who are proponents of the throwing of objects also bring buckets of rocks into classrooms. And they'll shove the kids in the back corner of the classroom and give them a bucket of rocks. Some of them will even go as far as saying the teacher should be by the door to help deal with the threat. They're making that effort. But now you have the kids in the back of the classroom ready to throw rocks, pelting potentially even the teacher. Who's to say that they have accurate aim? Who's to say that any one of those rocks is going to have a David and Goliath moment and take out the shooter on first hit? Odds are it's not. And they say, well, they'll go through the OODA loop process. They're going to be focused on the objects and the rocks and the bricks or whatever it is being thrown at them. Well, they will for the first or second throw of an item. But once they've determined that the objects are being thrown at them, they're going to re-observe and orient what the real threat to them is, which is you throwing the objects. And their decision will then be to act against you versus deal with those objects flying at them. And in doing so, they will eliminate what's coming at them. The OODA loop process can be applied in certain situations and circumstances. Let's take this back to the classroom. But it is not a be-all, end-all as it is taught. All right, so this time, instead of bringing out the board, I just got a little bit of a drawing to illustrate this point. All right, we got our teacher and a handful of students. When would OODA loop apply? Now, it's when you're the first classroom of attack. So now, let's first go over the scenario I just said, though. What people were being taught. They're shoving their kids in the back of the classroom. And let's even give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they're putting the teacher right here by the door. Okay? They have a bucket of rocks. Individual with firearm comes in and boom, stop. Now, this person may be out of that line of fire. I'm going to use a couple of pens. The line of fire coming this way. They may be in a position where they're not in that line of fire. Let's say they're even on this side of the door. It may be they're not in the line of fire. But who is? These kids. What's to say this person doesn't just start pulling the trigger? Or even if they're not thinking about it, it just gets pulled. Let's say this teacher grabs hold of that firearm, and in the process of grabbing it to gain control of it, they accidentally discharge a round. This is exactly why you do not want anybody back here. Okay? They are still, Some schools, they like to use the red line of life safety. They put like tape on the ground and say, go hide behind that line, you'll be safe. Ridiculousness. People with good intentions, but poor information. You need your people with you. Whether it's this side of the door, or if it happens to make sense, that side of the door. We can talk about that in other videos, but you're setting up and you are dealing with this threat. This is where you want to be set up. But now, let's take it back to the classroom though. Regular classroom, there's been no notification. You are the first target. You had no clue. Or maybe you weren't the first target, but you had no clue of what was going on. Individual enters your space and boom, you are now in the fight. You got distance here though. You have a firearm potentially facing at you. You are potentially within that line of fire. You yourself, I'm going to put you in this position, although you could be in the student's position. You yourself are now going through the OODA loop process. You observed your threat. You have to orient to your threat. They're there, I am here. You have to decide what you're going to do about that threat and then act upon that threat. They are in the act process. They are already ahead of you 4 steps. They've gone through observe, orient. They've already decided by entering this space, they're already ready to commit to their actions. This is where it is a throw or toss or leap of faith. Many teachers have desks near the front or objects near their grasp where they can grab something. Usually it's at that. I like to tell my teaching staff, grab that mug that you have on your desk that says greatest teacher in the world, that's full of all those pens and pencils. Grab that and toss that towards the shooter. This is just a distraction. You're not actually going to hurt them or disable them or take them out. Even if you had a rock or a baseball, you're not stopping them. You're using that to distract them. You're tossing it at them to try to force them all the way back into that observe, orient, decide, act. You want to force them back into that mental process, but you have a fraction of a second, because then your job is to close the distance, close with and stop that threat. That is the one time that doing the OODA loop makes sense. You can't just keep throwing objects at them. I want to close the fight portion by sharing the story of Senior Chief Retired Mike Day. This is meant to revisit that. What do I do if I get shot in the process? And as mentioned in that first video by Shane, your fight isn't over until it's over, until you can no longer have the ability to fight. So Senior Chief Retired Mike Day, I actually just learned as I was re-looking up his story before this video that he took his own life last year, March. He battled PTSD and suffered PTSD and traumatic brain injury, as well as still sustained pain and ailments from this particular event that he survived. So what did he do? He was point man on a SEAL team entering into a small room in Iraq, and he was the first guy in the door, and he immediately started taking gunfire, automatic gunfire, and he was shot 27 times. 11 of those rounds hit him in the bullet-resistant vest, his body armor. Now, you'll commonly hear bulletproof. Bulletproof is not real. There's no such thing as bulletproof. There's bullet resistance, and there's levels of bullet resistance. Nothing is truly bulletproof. Now, those vests, and you can see him wearing, one of those load-bearing vests right there, and he's probably got, a plate carrier. His the plates and the armor that he was wearing, and here's another one of him wearing armor. This looks like more like the full-sized armor. It was designed to stop one bullet. That's it. 11 rounds struck that armor and were stopped. That's a miracle in itself. But it's not like the movies where he gets hit and just keeps on fighting. That's blunt force trauma, broken ribs, severe bruising. I mean, imagine getting the wind knocked out of you. 11-fold was the hardest mule kicks you can ever imagine. That's what he suffered. 11 of them hit there. The other 16 riddled the rest of his body, his arms, his legs, his groin, his buttocks. The only thing that didn't get hit was his head. 16 shots to the body, 11 to the body armor. He continued to fight. And he even had a grenade went off and shrapnel got blasted and struck him. He continued to fight, took out all the insurgents in that room while still maintaining and preserving the lives of innocent women and children who were also present. He then got himself up, carried himself to the helicopter evac point. The human body is amazing. And we would share this story for two reasons. One, to let you have some hope. Just because you're shot, just because you're injured, doesn't mean your fight is over. Adrenaline is going to be kicking in. And adrenaline does wonders for saving your life. The other thing we say this is to remind you of the improvised weapons. To think that you can take that pair of scissors, to take that rock, to take those blunt objects, take that hot pot of coffee, and think that you're going to stir up a determined shooter from what their act is. To think that you can stop them with those objects is ignorant, foolish, and dangerous. You have to control the weapon because that is their threat. So, let your thoughts and prayers go to the family of Senior Chief Retired Mike Day. He was battling his own demons, and that really is tragic that he took his own life. Our next episode, we're going to now move on from the fight portion and talk about the runs. We've talked about the hide, which we now call the assess. We've talked about the fight portion in brutal detail. Now we're going to be moving on to run.